The final weeks of Michael Jackson's life were supposed to mark the beginning of one of the greatest comebacks in entertainment history. After years of controversy, financial pressure, and public scrutiny, he was preparing for a series of performances that many believed would redefine his legacy. Thousands of fans were waiting, tickets were disappearing within hours, rehearsals were underway. From the outside, it looked as though Michael Jackson was finally regaining control of a life that had spent decades under an unforgiving spotlight. But then something happened that investigators would spend years trying to understand. What Michael Jackson did shortly before his death left behind a trail of questions that still refused to disappear. When news broke on June 25, 2009, the world reacted with disbelief. The king of pop was gone. Television networks interrupted their programming. Radio stations switched to non-stop Michael Jackson music. Crowds gathered outside hospitals, recording studios, and landmarks around the globe. It felt impossible that someone so famous, so recognizable, could simply vanish in a single afternoon. Yet while the public mourned, another story was quietly unfolding behind closed doors. Investigators entering Jackson's final world expected to find answers. Instead, they discovered contradictions. The closer they looked, the stranger certain details became. Friends described a man obsessed with preparing for the future. He was making plans, discussing upcoming projects, talking about performances that had not yet happened. People working around him claimed he seemed intensely focused on what came next. That alone created confusion. It did not fit the picture many expected. Then came the reports about his final days. Some witnesses described exhaustion, others described determination. Certain accounts painted him as physically fragile, while others insisted he was energized and fully committed to returning to the stage. These conflicting descriptions immediately created a puzzle. How could people who spent time around the same individual walk away with such different impressions? The mystery only deepened when investigators began examining his activities during the final stretch before his death. Michael Jackson was not hiding from the world. In fact, he was spending long hours in rehearsals. Cameras captured him dancing, singing, and discussing creative details. Footage showed someone still deeply invested in performance. Yet behind those public moments existed another reality that few fully understood. People close to the production began recalling unusual conversations. There were concerns, there were disagreements, there were private worries that would not become public until much later. At first, each detail seemed insignificant on its own. A comment here, a decision there, a behavior that felt unusual but not alarming. Yet, when investigators eventually placed these pieces together, a larger picture started emerging. And that picture raised an unsettling possibility. What if the most important clues were not found on the day Michael Jackson died? What if they were hidden within the decisions he made beforehand? Because as authorities retraced his final movements, they discovered actions that seemed to point in different directions at the same time. Some suggested confidence about the future. Others hinted at growing pressure behind the scenes. The result was a mystery that refused to fit neatly into a single explanation. And as investigators dug deeper into the environment surrounding Jackson's planned comeback, they began uncovering details that would transform a tragic death into one of the most debated stories in modern entertainment history. The questions were only beginning. In the months leading up to his death, Michael Jackson found himself standing at a crossroads unlike any he had faced before. For decades, he had been one of the most recognizable figures on earth. His music had shattered records, his performances had influenced generations, and his name alone could dominate headlines anywhere in the world. Yet, beneath that extraordinary success was a reality far more complicated than most people realized. By 2009, Jackson was living under immense pressure. Financial obligations had been mounting for years. Maintaining properties, supporting staff, handling legal battles, and sustaining a lifestyle built during the peak of his fame had become increasingly difficult. While the public often viewed him as endlessly wealthy, those closest to his business affairs knew the situation was far more fragile. That was one reason the announcement of the upcoming concert series carried such significance. The shows were not simply another tour. They represented a potential turning point. When the performances were announced in London, demand exploded almost instantly. What began as a limited number of appearances quickly expanded as ticket sales exceeded expectations. Fans from around the world rushed to secure seats. Industry insiders started describing the event as one of the biggest comeback stories ever attempted. For Michael Jackson, however, success came with a price. The larger the project became, the greater the expectations surrounding it. Every rehearsal was scrutinized. Every meeting carried consequences. Every delay attracted attention. Those working behind the scenes described an environment that grew increasingly intense as opening night approached. Production teams were constructing elaborate stage designs. Choreographers were refining routines. Musicians rehearsed endlessly. Executives monitored schedules with growing urgency. And at the center of it all stood Jackson himself. Witnesses recalled that he remained heavily involved in creative decisions. He discussed light effects, camera angles, musical arrangements, and performance details. Even after decades in the industry, he still demanded precision. But alongside that dedication came concerns. Some members of the production reportedly noticed when Jackson appeared physically drained. Others insisted he looked stronger than he had in years. These opposing observations would later become a major source of confusion. Investigators reviewing witness statements found themselves confronting the same contradiction repeatedly. One person would describe a performer preparing confidently for a historic return. Another would describe someone struggling under the weight of overwhelming demands. Both accounts came from people who genuinely believed they were telling the truth. Meanwhile, away from rehearsal stages and public announcements, Jackson's private life remained largely hidden from view. Only a small circle had access to his daily routine. Only a handful of people knew what was happening behind closed doors. As investigators later discovered, many crucial events occurred in settings where very few witnesses were present. This made reconstructing his final weeks extraordinarily difficult. The challenge wasn't a lack of information. It was too much conflicting information. Every answer seemed to create another question. Why was someone planning so aggressively for future projects if serious problems were already developing? Why were some associates expressing optimism while others privately voiced concern? And perhaps most importantly, why did certain individuals remember specific events so differently? The deeper investigators looked into the atmosphere surrounding the comeback, the more complicated the story became. What initially appeared to be a straightforward narrative of preparation and anticipation slowly revealed hidden layers of stress, secrecy, and uncertainty, and somewhere within those layers lay the decisions Michael Jackson made before his death. Decisions that would later leave investigators wondering whether warning signs had been present all along. As rehearsals continued and the countdown to opening night grew shorter, events behind the scenes were beginning to move toward a critical turning point that almost nobody recognized at the time. As the opening date for the London concerts drew closer, the atmosphere around Michael Jackson changed in subtle ways that only became obvious afterward. On the surface, everything appeared to be moving forward. Rehearsal footage showed a performer still capable of commanding a stage. Crew members watched him discuss details with remarkable precision. Songs were refined, dance sequences were adjusted, visual effects were tested. To the public, the comeback looked increasingly real. Yet behind the excitement, cracks were beginning to form. The production itself had grown into a massive operation involving hundreds of people. Every day brought new deadlines. Every delay affected schedules, budgets, and expectations. What had started as a concert series was becoming an enormous machine, and that machine depended heavily on one person. Michael Jackson. Those closest to the rehearsals later recalled that he carried the weight of those expectations everywhere he went. Some days he appeared highly motivated, speaking enthusiastically about the future. He reportedly discussed ideas beyond the London shows, including projects that could extend years into the future. Such conversations suggested someone who believed he still had much left to accomplish. But there were other moments. Moments that would take on new meaning after his death. Several individuals later described periods when Jackson seemed unusually exhausted. Long rehearsals were followed by late nights. Demanding schedules left little room for recovery. The pressure to deliver a flawless comeback was immense, especially for someone whose every move would be analyzed by critics and fans alike. Investigators examining these accounts noticed a pattern. No single incident appeared alarming by itself. Instead, concern emerged from the accumulation of small details, a missed meeting, a change in routine, a conversation that seemed unimportant at the time, a growing dependence on a carefully controlled private environment. The deeper authorities dug, the more they realized that understanding Jackson's final days required understanding the people around him. That was where the story became significantly more complicated. Multiple individuals had direct access to Jackson during the weeks leading up to his death. Managers, security personnel, assistants, production staff, medical professionals, and longtime associates all occupied different positions within his world. Each person saw only part of the picture. Each person interpreted events through their own perspective. As investigators gathered statements, they encountered a recurring problem. Nobody seemed to possess the complete story. One witness would provide information that contradicted another. Someone would remember a conversation differently. Certain timelines failed to align perfectly. The result was a puzzle with missing pieces scattered across dozens of accounts. Then attention began shifting toward Jackson's private routines. What happened after rehearsals ended? Who was present during the late-night hours? What concerns, if any, were being discussed behind closed doors? These questions became increasingly important because many of the most significant events occurred away from cameras and public appearances. The more investigators learned, the more they realized that Jackson's public image during those final weeks represented only a fraction of reality. There was another side to the story, a quieter side, a side hidden inside private residences, confidential discussions, and personal struggles that rarely reached public view. As authorities reconstructed the timeline, they discovered that several decisions made during this period appeared difficult to explain. Some choices seemed logical when viewed independently. Others seemed surprisingly risky. Together, they created a pattern that investigators could not easily dismiss. What confused them most was that these actions did not point toward a single clear conclusion. Instead, they suggested competing possibilities. Was Jackson confidently preparing for a major return, or was he attempting to push through challenges that were becoming increasingly difficult to manage? The answer remained frustratingly unclear, and as investigators moved closer to reconstructing the final days before his death, they found themselves entering the most sensitive and controversial phase of the entire story, one that would eventually raise questions reaching far beyond Michael Jackson himself. By the time investigators reached the final stretch of Michael Jackson's timeline, the story had evolved from a celebrity death investigation into something far more complicated. The focus was no longer limited to concert preparations or financial pressures. Attention was turning toward the environment surrounding him during his final days. As authorities pieced together witness accounts, one detail became increasingly difficult to ignore. Jackson's schedule had become highly unusual. Rehearsals often extended late into the evening. After returning home, the night was far from over. While most people would be sleeping, activity frequently continued behind closed doors. For investigators, these nighttime hours became critically important. Many of the events that later drew scrutiny occurred when only a small number of individuals were present. This created a major problem. The fewer witnesses available, the harder it became to establish certainty. Instead of a clear sequence of events, investigators found overlapping stories, conflicting memories, and crucial gaps that required careful examination. At the same time, reports emerged suggesting that concerns had been raised before tragedy struck. Some individuals later claimed they had noticed warning signs. Others insisted nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Again, investigators encountered the same frustrating contradiction that had appeared throughout the case. Every potential clue seemed to point in two directions at once. Meanwhile, Jackson continued preparing for what was supposed to be his return to the global stage. Rehearsal footage captured only days before his death showed moments that would later become deeply significant. Viewers saw him singing, dancing, working through routines, giving instructions. To many observers, the footage appeared to show an artist still committed to his craft. For others, it revealed signs of strain. The interpretation depended largely on who was watching. That disagreement would continue for years. Then came the final 24 hours. Investigators spent enormous effort reconstructing this period because it represented the narrow window in which everything changed. Phone records were reviewed, schedules were examined, witnesses were interviewed repeatedly. Authorities wanted to understand not only what happened but why certain decisions were made. As details emerged, investigators discovered a series of actions that raised difficult questions. Why were particular choices made that night? Who approved them? Were concerns discussed beforehand? Could events have unfolded differently if alternative decisions had been made? Each answer seemed to create additional uncertainty. What made the situation even more confusing was that several individuals involved appeared convinced they were acting appropriately at the time. This was not a case where every participant agreed on what had happened. Far from it. Many descriptions differed dramatically. Some recollections changed over time, others remained consistent but conflicted with competing accounts. Investigators were forced to separate fact from interpretation while dealing with intense public attention. The world wanted immediate answers. The evidence refused to cooperate. Then authorities encountered a realization that changed the direction of the investigation. The most important questions might not involve the moment Michael Jackson died. Instead, they might involve the decisions made days, weeks, and even months before that moment. Because when investigators stepped back and examined the larger picture, they saw a chain of events rather than a single incident. Pressure had been building, schedules had intensified, private concerns had emerged. Critical choices had been made behind closed doors, and now those choices were being examined under a microscope. The further investigators looked into that chain, the more they began to suspect that understanding Jackson's death required understanding the extraordinary circumstances surrounding his attempted comeback. What they uncovered next would transform public perception of the case and place several key figures under unprecedented scrutiny. And once those questions entered the spotlight, there would be no turning back. As investigators intensified their examination of Michael Jackson's final days, public attention shifted dramatically. The story was no longer focused solely on the loss of a global superstar. Now people wanted to know whether warning signs had existed long before June 25, 2009. Questions multiplied with every new revelation. Investigators began reviewing not only the events immediately surrounding Jackson's death, but also the circumstances that had gradually developed during the months leading up to it. What they discovered was a situation far more complex than many initially assumed. The comeback effort that had generated worldwide excitement was also creating extraordinary pressure. Every major rehearsal carried enormous financial implications. Every postponed decision affected dozens of departments. Every adjustment created ripple effects throughout the production. People involved with the concerts later described an environment where expectations continued rising as opening night approached. The success of the entire project depended upon Jackson's ability to perform at the level audiences expected, and audiences expected perfection. That expectation mattered because Michael Jackson was not being compared to other performers. He was being compared to Michael Jackson. The legendary image built over decades created a standard almost impossible for anyone to satisfy. As investigators reconstructed the broader timeline, they discovered that many individuals around Jackson were balancing competing priorities. Some were focused on protecting his health, others were focused on ensuring the concerts proceeded as planned. Many were attempting to do both simultaneously. That balancing act created tensions that were not always visible from the outside. Behind closed doors, disagreements reportedly occurred regarding schedules, responsibilities, and concerns about Jackson's condition. Some witnesses later suggested there had been growing unease among certain members of the team. Others strongly rejected that characterization. The conflicting narratives once again complicated the investigation. Authorities found themselves evaluating statements that often reflected personal perspectives as much as objective facts. Then another issue emerged. Investigators realized that the decisions made during Jackson's final period were interconnected. One choice influenced another, one accommodation led to additional accommodations, one solution created new complications. Viewed individually, these decisions often appeared reasonable. Viewed together, they formed a pattern that raised difficult questions. Could the situation have been altered if different choices had been made earlier? Could warning signs have been recognized more clearly? Or were people only identifying those signs because they already knew the outcome? These questions became central to the investigation. Public debate intensified as details entered the media. Experts offered differing interpretations. Former associates shared memories. Fans analyzed every available piece of information. Yet, despite countless discussions, certainty remained elusive. What made the case so unusual was the contrast between Jackson's apparent plans for the future and the tragedy that followed. Investigators uncovered evidence of ongoing projects. There were discussions about future performances. Creative ideas were still being explored. Business opportunities remained under consideration. The image that emerged was not one of someone preparing to disappear from public life. It was the image of someone still looking ahead. That contradiction continued to puzzle investigators. How could a person be making plans that extended months and years into the future, while simultaneously existing within circumstances that appeared increasingly fragile? The answer was not simple. In fact, the deeper authorities dug, the less straightforward the story became. Every new finding added another layer. Every witness introduced additional context. Every document revealed fresh complexities. By this stage, investigators understood they were no longer examining a single event. They were examining an entire system of relationships, decisions, pressures, and responsibilities that had converged around one of the most famous individuals in history. And as scrutiny intensified, attention began narrowing toward the people whose actions during those critical final hours would become the subject of intense legal battles, public controversy, and years of debate. The investigation was approaching its most explosive phase, and the conclusions reached during that phase would forever shape how the world remembered Michael Jackson's final chapter. Part 6. By the time the investigation reached its most critical stage, nearly every thread in the story was converging toward a single point: the final hours. Authorities had gathered witness statements, reviewed records, reconstructed timelines, and examined countless details. Yet despite the volume of information, one fact remained unchanged. Michael Jackson was gone. The challenge now was determining exactly how the circumstances surrounding him had reached that outcome. As investigators narrowed their focus, attention increasingly centered on decisions made during the last night of his life. Those decisions would eventually become the subject of courtroom testimony, expert analysis, and worldwide debate. The more evidence investigators reviewed, the more they became convinced that the events of June 25 could not be viewed in isolation. The story stretched backward. It connected to weeks of preparation, months of pressure, years of accumulated challenges. What happened during those final hours appeared to be the endpoint of a much longer chain of events. That realization changed everything. Instead of searching for a single explanation, investigators began examining how multiple factors may have interacted with one another. Physical demands, professional expectations, personal concerns, and private decisions all became part of the larger picture. Meanwhile, public fascination reached extraordinary levels. Every development generated headlines. Every court appearance attracted cameras. Every new revelation sparked fresh arguments. Some people believed the investigation had already uncovered the truth. Others argued that important questions remained unanswered. The disagreements were intense because Michael Jackson was not an ordinary public figure. His life had always generated strong reactions. His death proved no different. As legal proceedings unfolded, testimony offered a rare glimpse into the private world surrounding the singer's final months. Witnesses described rehearsals, conversations, concerns, expectations, and responsibilities. Piece by piece, a clearer picture emerged. Yet even as details became clearer, the emotional impact remained profound. Many who worked with Jackson spoke about his excitement regarding the future. Others recalled moments of concern. Both memories existed simultaneously, and perhaps that was what made the story so difficult to fully understand. The same individual could appear hopeful and vulnerable, determined and exhausted, confident and pressured. Investigators ultimately concluded that the circumstances surrounding Jackson's death were shaped by a combination of choices and conditions rather than a single dramatic moment. But even after official findings were reached, public debate continued. because the case had evolved into something larger than an investigation. It had become a symbol of fame, pressure, expectation, and the hidden costs that sometimes accompany global celebrity. As the legal battles neared their conclusion, one final question lingered above all others. What would Michael Jackson's lasting legacy ultimately become? The answer would begin to reveal itself in the years that followed.